Juste pour vous dire qu'on va attendre quelques minutes que tout le monde soit ici pour commencer. C'est dimanche.
Mais c'est quand même un bon moment pour 11h30 un dimanche, je trouve.
Encore une fois, on aurait dit aux gens ce soir en avant.
Oui, je trouve que au moins, quand je vais être au milieu avec le micro, les gens en arrière ne pourront pas se
Tu veux
fâcher.
te mettre au milieu en arrière?
Je vais le mettre là.
Parce que c'est tout.
Le micro, mais après ça, moi, je vais m'asseoir là. Fait que le deuxième micro qui est là pour servir.
C'est ça.
Mais il y en a un autre pour les.
C'est ça. Mais
Ben, comme ça, sinon, on pourrait en avoir deux, ouais.
Mais je pense que si les gens se mettent en ligne, c'est parfait.
Ouais. Ils ont le temps, puis il n'y a pas si rien qui peut aller en arrière. C'est cool, c'est 700 places, mais c'est pas si huge.
C'est ça que je disais là, quand on l'a pris, là, c'est que c'est comme cosy. Là.
Ouais.
La seule chose, c'est qu'il fait facilement très chaud.
Ouais. Tu l'as-tu?
Ah oui, j'ai amené mon ordi, mais je peux prendre le tien, là, vu que... Je vais juste changer ça de place. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à notre dernière grande conférence de la grande transition, Repolitiser la question climatique. Je m'appelle Violette Drouin et je suis une des co-coordonnatrices de l'événement. Nous sommes vraiment heureux et heureuses de vous accueillir ici à Concordia. L'Université Concordia et la Ville de Montréal, ou Jojage, sont situés sur les territoires de la nation Kanien'kehá:ka. Alors qu'on se rassemble pour une conférence sur le climat et l'exploitation de la planète et de ses habitants, il est essentiel de reconnaître que le territoire où nous nous trouvons a été façonné par des siècles de colonisation et de violence. L'Université Concordia n'est pas non plus l'exception. L'administration de l'institution n'a que récemment présenté ses excuses pour avoir participé à l'arrestation d'étudiants et étudiantes noirs lors d'une manifestation contre le racisme institutionnel en 1969. Les lieux que nous fréquentons sont tous imprégnés d'injustices systémiques. L'une des motivations du collectif La Grande Transition est d'apprendre et de discuter en profondeur de celles-ci dans le but de les réparer et de créer un monde meilleur. Nous souhaitons reconnaître le territoire sur lequel nous nous tenons pour rappeler qu'il n'existe pas d'anticapitalisme sans antiracisme ou sans décolonisation. La Grande Transition fait partie du réseau international Historical Materialism. Cette année, l'événement est organisé par un collectif de militants et militantes et académiques en partenariat avec l'ONG Alternative. J'aimerais remercier particulièrement Alternative pour tout leur soutien à la tenue de la conférence. Alternative et toute son équipe ont été absolument indispensables à tous les stades de la planification. J'aimerais aussi remercier nos formidables interprètes qui ont fait un travail vraiment incroyable pendant toute la conférence. Et enfin, nous aimerions remercier nos généreux donateurs et partenaires, Spectre Journal, le syndicat général des professeurs et professeurs de l'Université de Montréal, la STT-CSN, l'Association des professeurs de l'Université d'Ottawa, le Conseil central de Montréal métropolitain de la CSN, la Fédération autonome de l'enseignement, l'École d'innovation sociale Élisabeth Bruyère de l'Université Saint-Paul, le syndicat des professeurs de l'UQAM, le député Alexandre Boulris, le syndicat des professeurs de l'Université du Québec en Outaouais, le député Guillaume Clich-Rivard, la Confédération des syndicats nationaux, le syndicat du personnel enseignant du Collège AUNTIC, la Fédération de l'enseignement collégial et la Fédération nationale des enseignants et des enseignantes du Québec. Enfin, quelques rappels pour cette conférence. Nous vous demandons de, s'il vous plaît, fermer la sonnerie de vos téléphones. Nous vous encourageons fortement à porter un masque pour toute la durée de cet événement. Cette conférence est munie de traductions simultanées de l'anglais vers le français et vice-versa. Si vous avez besoin d'un casque d'écoute, ils sont disponibles à l'entrée de la salle. Lors de la période de questions, si vous souhaitez poser une question, veuillez vous diriger vers moi. Je vais être au milieu de la salle avec un micro. Et par respect pour les panélistes et les autres participants et participantes, veuillez limiter vos interventions en termes de temps. Et enfin, cette conférence est diffusée en direct sur YouTube. Le public est seulement visible de dos, mais si vous posez une question, on va entendre votre voix dans la diffusion en direct. Et je passe la parole à Maïka.
Merci, Violette. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour tout le monde. Ouh, c'est dimanche. La dernière journée de la semaine, juste avant la première journée de la semaine. Donc, je m'appelle Maïka, c'est mon dernier bonjour. Je suis la porte-parole du collectif La Grande Transition. Et je voulais tenir aussi à souligner la participation d'Alternative, sans qui cet événement n'aurait pas eu lieu. Aussi, le support incommensurable de Historical Materialism. On fait partie d'un réseau international de HM pour les intimes. Ensuite, just a note before, so for those of you who didn't get it, there's live translation, so you can just go get a headset at the entrance because some panelists are going to speak in French. Oui, l'autre appel logistique que je voulais souligner, c'est que Violette fait un travail extraordinaire de courir partout avec le micro jusqu'ici. Merci. Mais après 4 jours, on apprend de nos erreurs, on va essayer de la décharger un peu. Donc, on vous demanderait de vous lever puis d'aller. Il va y avoir une file où Violette pourra seulement rester là où les gens veulent aller poser des questions. Comme ça, on va s'épargner des tendinites. Donc, et parlant de Violette, Drouin et Malika Gender, qui est à l'entrée en train de encore travailler. Les deux coordonnatrices ont fait des heures incroyables. Donc, environ 14 heures par jour depuis les 3 derniers jours, mais aussi depuis les derniers mois. Depuis l'automne, réellement. Donc, je voudrais vraiment vous souligner leur travail, puis peut-être une main d'applaudissement parce que ça vaut... Je pense que j'ai jamais connu des gens qui répondaient aussi rapidement au courriel de jour et de nuit. Bon, dernier applaudissement. Je voudrais savoir, on se demandait, là, on se posait la question si ça vous dirait qu'on organise une grande transition 2025. Fait que par applaudissement. Bon, c'est bon. On va le faire. On va le faire. OK, on va le faire. Mais aux 2 ans, parce que là, à chaque année, ça va nous prendre une année pour se reposer. Dans tous les cas, allez aimer la page Facebook du collectif La Grande Transition pour vous tenir au courant des activités. Et n'hésitez pas à soumettre un panel pour 2025. Donc, c'est tout ce que j'avais à vous dire. Merci. Merci de vous être déplacés un dimanche. Merci de vous être déplacés pendant les 4 derniers jours, d'encourager le post-capitalisme qui, comme Violette l'a souligné, ne vient pas sans antiracisme ni sans questionner les pratiques coloniales. Et donc, sans plus tarder, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à nos panélistes, Sabrina Fernandes, Mohamed, Amer, Meziane et Matthew Huber, et notre animatrice, l'incomparable Maude Prud'homme. Merci.
Bonjour tout le monde. Ravi de vous voir ce dimanche matin. Vous allez découvrir une facette de moi pour des gens qu'on se connaît. Je vais parler en English pour la majorité de la présentation par en tout cas, intention de continuité linguistique, puisqu'en fait, les panélistes vont intervenir en anglais. Ceci dit, bien sûr, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français. Oui, il y a effectivement la traduction. Donc, nous voici réunis en ce dimanche matin, effectivement, pour discuter de la repolitisation de la question climatique. Now I will switch to English. I will switch to English. All right. So, how can we repoliticize power relation within environmental movement? This panel puts political struggles at the center of the climate questions, or more accurately, the climate crisis. It presents environmental activists and thinkers from Tunisia, Brazil, and the United States. I will add to these questions that we have a few given challenges. One of them is time. The time it takes to do things at the time we have to do things, and how to coincide and how to live with the challenges that imposes. We also have a trend of depth, the depth of change and the ambition of the changes we want to make happen, we want to create. And challenges of transformation of the infrastructures, transformation of our movements, and transformation of the lives we weave daily through reproductive work. So that's what I'm adding to this. You can weave them in or not. And we're going to start with, the speakers. Then I will ask a question to each speaker. I will invite them then to question each other. And then we will open to the public. Perhaps I will ask like one last question, but then so your time will come, but it will not be right after the presentations. All right? All right. So here we welcome Sabrina Fernandes. She is a sociologist and political economist and postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Latin American Studies at the University of Guadalajara. She is also a senior research advisor to the Alameda Institute and founder of the political education project, %ses. Her research and publications draw from Marxist ecology to discuss just transition and their contradictions, leftist strategy and organizing. She was formerly an editor at Jacobin and Jacobin Brasil and a research fellow with the Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung. As an eco-socialist organizer, she is a member of the steering committee of the Global Eco-Socialist Network and the Eco-Social and Intercultural Pact of the South. Please welcome Sabrina Fernandes.
Thank you, Maude. Thank you all for being here this Sunday morning, and thank you to the organizers of the Great Transition. I've been here before at this conference. It's always a pleasure. I think it's actually one of the most interesting conferences that I always attend because there's always this great mix of like academic discussion with very grassroots discussion from people doing work on the ground as well. So I learn a lot. Thank you. I've learned a lot from you these past days. I want to, we're each speaking like a little introduction, and then we're going to get into the discussion. So I hope I can make this within 10 minutes. But I want to make 3 points on repoliticizing the climate question. And I think the first point to be made, and they sort of connect to what Maude was talking about in terms of time. A lot of my research right now is connected to transition and temporalities. So I think it makes sense. But the first point that I want to make is actually about climate denialism and how it is not what people think it is. So for a really long time, we have come to define climate denialism as that kind of scientific denialism of people who say there's no such thing as climate change, it's volcanoes, or the weather changes all the time, or there's like a big conspiracy out there to make us stop using cars. And so there's like this level of climate denialism, and we know there's power involved in how this climate denialism became popular. We've all seen reports from ExxonMobil saying they helped to fuel this debate and they bought researchers. And I think this is pretty much set now. We know about this, and with time, a lot of the reports coming from climate scientists have been quite important for us to have a tool to say, no, this is the solid science behind this. There's a lot of consensus. And of course, you may have heard one person here or there disagree, but we have enough to make it a scientific consensus. So there's general knowledge about this. And so when Trump comes along, or Bolsonaro in Brazil comes along, and this far right, quite connected to fossil capital, comes along and brings back a little bit of that traditional climate denialism, we start to identify this as the main problem again. So I want to challenge that. I don't think this is our problem with climate denialism. Our problem with climate denialism is green capitalism. This is the main version of denialism that we have nowadays, because it works quite well by grabbing a little piece of truth. Yes, climate change is a problem. Yes, it's actually happening right now. So a lot of green capitalists will give us that. They will even say that, no, it's not something in the future. We are already seeing the impacts. And that's why I'm going to present you this big investment portfolio that I have for green funds. It's usually how it works. So why is this denialism as well? First of all, because I don't consider climate science to be just a part of running numbers and looking to the chemistry. I consider myself, for example, to be a climate scientist. I've been working on climate change and transition for almost 15 years now. And from this understanding, we know that if we're talking about climate change, we're also talking about capitalism. We are also talking about power relations. And if a part of the science around climate change is being denied in terms of the connection to capitalist power relations, this is making its way into the mainstream also as climate denialism. And we know that this works in very particular ways for those who are interested in hijacking the conversation around transition and even using the language of just transition in their own favor. So we could mention, for example, what happens with the UNFCCC negotiations and the COPs every year. So last year in Egypt, this year is happening in Dubai. And right now in Dubai, we already have some reports from how the government is saying that this can be said, this cannot be said. So not only is this getting hijacked in the sense that we're not allowed to do certain things, just exposing how unequal the system is right there, but also how fossil capital itself is basically completing this project of hijacking the entire conversation around climate negotiations. A while back, some of these fossil fuel companies, they had to make their way into the delegations of particular countries. So talking about my own country here in Brazil, we've had people from Shell, for example, right there directly inside the official delegation with all the accesses that people from the government would have to negotiate. But now even the UN will roll out a red carpet through the Global Compact and other frameworks to make sure that we are in dialogue with all of the stakeholders here. And every year during the COP, we're seeing the place becoming even more corporatized. So there's a lot of sponsorship and is a special place for them to say what they want to say. And if you look into the day that discussions are divided during the negotiations, you're going to have something like Youth Day or Energy Day. And often you find that these corporations, for example, on Energy Day, they'll come along and they'll talk about their new green patents and these wonderful things that they're doing around green hydrogen or solar photovoltaic power. And they become the norm. They are setting the agenda. And when they set the agenda, we end up following because we're still in a problem. And like Matt has discussed this yesterday as well. Well, we don't have mass politics behind it, but they have a lot of capital. They have a lot of power. So they're setting the ways that we do things. So even though conversations around climate change are becoming more and more mainstream because there are big bad things happening all the time. So we've talked about hurricanes, floods, and this is affecting not just the most vulnerable communities anymore. So that we're able to say that Pakistan, it became like last year, like a model for us to look into. This is how big of a disaster you could have. But also we're talking about big floods in Germany, in Switzerland, or droughts that even got in the way of providing nuclear power in France because they didn't, like the level of water in the rivers wasn't enough for them to keep their nuclear power going. So the crisis is taking on many different aspects and it becomes quite obvious. But because it's becoming more obvious and because people are saying, yes, climate change is a problem, I recognize that it is, somebody should do something about it, it doesn't mean that the proper things are actually being done because we're getting lost in translation around the root cause still. So first point, climate denialism is an issue today in the way that green capitalism has hijacked it and it's providing us false solutions. And the main problem with these false solutions is that they give us the illusion that something's being made externally, something's being done externally. So maybe I don't need to engage with it that much. The technocrats are dealing with it. The government is dealing with that. But it's also a problem because it's stealing our time. Effectively, our time is being taken away because of these false solutions. My other point connects to that because if we are dealing with climate change, we're dealing with something that's creating havoc in our society. So we're talking about changes that mess with history, multiple scales, multiple temporalities. And that also means that when we are dealing with the creation of solutions, we're also dealing with the creation of problems, new problems. And often when we look at that, we say, okay, so we're creating a problem here, we should run away. I would say, not really. We just need to be very precise and develop criteria and priorities in terms of what kind of problems we are creating. So we're also building the conditions to solve them. I think this is a little bit abstract, so I'll elaborate a little bit on that. My point is that contradiction is a main point in transition. You cannot have transition without creating contradictions. And this becomes quite obvious when we look into international political economy and how society is built different in the global north, in the global south. We have something we call uneven development. The availability of resources, they vary a lot. The expectation for a mode of living is quite different. We have different cultures. So all of these differences, they're not necessarily a bad thing, but the way power is organized across them is still very much plagued by patterns of colonialism, imperialism, and heteropatriarchy, lots of issues around excluding people on the basis of disability, on the basis of race. So we need to be discussing these things in terms of the contradictions that are also being created when we come up with a huge project for transition. And in terms of this, I've gotten into the habit in my work of talking then about multiple transitions to try to grasp the different scales. So I would start perhaps talking about energy transition, and then I would talk about climate transition, then ecological transition as something that bigs into a bigger temporal line here, but also in terms of scale. And by doing that, I get to look into how complicated things are, in the sense that the larger my project of transition is, the deeper I have to go into anti-capitalist work. And the more complicated it becomes, because sometimes some of the challenges that we're facing are built within the left. The left that sometimes might not be doing climate denialism in the sense of embracing green capitalism, but might be doing that in the sense that we face a lot in Latin America of saying that, well, we have time, we need to develop first, so let's just drill for more oil. And let them pay the price now, we have time. So this is a type of climate denialism we find in the left, but also with green capitalism, hijacking conversations, with carbon markets being presented as big solutions, and so on. So when we're looking into these contradictions, it means that we're going to have transition projects that need to have some level of coordination. And this level of coordination has to be very internationalist, which brings me to the third point. Hopefully in the discussion, I'll be able to elaborate more into that. We have fragmented experiences when we look into international political economy. So the international division of labor means you have overexploitation of workers in particular areas. You have the creation of sacrifice zones because of particular activities, for example, extractivist activities. And sometimes they come at a cost. They're just purely local. Sometimes when we look into it, the cost is actually quite global. And when we're looking around extractivism, we find that, for example, the huge demand for minerals connected to energy transition around primarily solar and also onshore and offshore wind means that we have a rush right now for these green strategic minerals, so much that the World Bank is talking about a rise in demand around 500% or more. And then countries in the global south are jumping at the idea that, well, maybe we'll finally develop in this pattern. But a lot of the investment that's being done is still coming from private corporations that are painting themselves green, saying that we're providing energy transition, but they're actually just doing diversification. So my last point to close here is that we need to develop ways for internationalist collaboration around planning here, because the framework for using resources is being imposed from outside, from these that are providing the false solutions, they're stealing our time in the process. And many times when we're discussing transition, we're still thinking of it in a domestic framework. So this is my country, these are my organizations, and we're going to have this big project here with so many funds for this. Whereas when we're talking about the scale of climate change and the ecological crisis at large, to avoid a carbon tunnel vision, when we look at just in terms of emissions, we need to connect in terms of the impacts and the necessities of other places as well. Such, for example, the fact that we have almost 800 million people in the world without proper access to electricity. So is it that, or is it about more and more individual electric vehicles as Elon Musk will have it?
Thank you very much. That was rich. There's this temptation to talk faster, to put more stuff into 10 to 12 minutes. I invite you to empathy with the translators. Thank you. But it was not a reproach. It's really good. We will now welcome Matt Huber, who is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environment and the Environment at the Syracuse University. His work focuses on the relationships between energy, capitalism, and the politics of climate change. He is the author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, and Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Climate. He's a regular contributor to the Jacobin magazine. Here is Matt Huber.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maude. Thanks so much to the organizers. I know that there was just incredible attention to detail on all the little things to pull off something like this. So really appreciative to be on this panel with these other brilliant thinkers and activists. So, and also feel a bit of pressure to, it's the closing panel. We want to close with a bang. So thank you all for coming. So there seems to be a kind of, at least in the United States, this kind of strange optimism that we might be finally turning the corner on the climate crisis. Renewable energy is becoming incredibly cheap. Countries and many corporations have announced their net zero targets. The United States has passed its first major climate legislation, which is, of course, an extremely low bar. But I'm really, I hate to sort of rain on the parade here, but I'm here to report that the picture is not as rosy as we might think. We really aren't winning on climate until we start to see significant emission reductions. And in 2022, we set another record for emissions, right? It's really unclear when emissions are going to peak, and they should have peaked yesterday, decades ago, right? The other surreal aspect of the current moment is that fossil fuels are as profitable as ever. ExxonMobil announced record profits in October of last year and then beat those records in January. In February, a Financial Times opinion columnist brought up that Shell has a real big problem right now. They have something called a cash flow crisis, which means they have more money, they don't really know what to do with it. That same month, the same paper ran a story entitled, quote, "Coal's comeback pays off for hedge funds." They interviewed one of the lucky hedge fund operators whose coal funds have gained 44% returns last year, 44%. And this guy had the gall to say this, quote, "It's almost immoral not to invest in coal because of the reliance of so many countries on fossil fuels. Immoral not to invest in coal." This is the mindset of the capitalist class. These are the people who actually control and profit from our energy system. These are the people who are hell-bent on gaining returns on fossil fuel investments for decades to come. And so the climate movement really needs to find a way to confront the power of these people if we want to salvage a habitable planet. So what is to be done about this? And again, I'm sorry to be somewhat sort of a downer here, but today I want to talk about how the climate movement itself is still far too weak and lacks the kind of power it would take to actually confront this crisis. This power struggle, I think, is not just like kind of like a sectoral struggle against fossil capital, but actually I'd argue a much wider struggle against the capitalist class as a whole, which is steadfast in its adherence to austerity economics and who will resist at every turn the kind of considerable investments in public infrastructure and socialized planning that are required to solve the crisis. So in my book, Climate Change is Class War, I argue this is not just a power struggle, but it's a class struggle. And the main point I want to reflect on today is that what we often call the climate justice movement is in fact sometimes a very narrow class coalition between highly educated professional class folks, people based in NGOs, people based in academia. It's a coalition between these highly educated people and so-called marginalized communities, often called frontline communities, the people most threatened by climate change, the people most exposed to the toxic infrastructure of the fossil economy. And this coalition is fueled by a correct sentiment, which is rooted in a kind of moral righteousness and ideas of justice, that those least responsible for the climate change, like indigenous communities, like peasant communities, these are the people bearing the worst effects from the crisis, while those most responsible for the crisis are able to insulate themselves in kind of enclaves of privatism while the world burns. But moral righteousness is not equal to power. And that's what we lack still in this struggle. So to build a actually powerful climate movement, I think the Climate Justice Coalition lacks two critical ingredients. First, in the book, I argue really the climate crisis is a crisis of our industrial system of production. It's about how we produce our material existence, but it's really about how we produce things like electricity, cement, steel, chemicals, and the infrastructure that moves all this industrial stuff around. So if we want to overhaul such an industrial system, if we're socialist, we're really going to have to organize with the skilled industrial workers that, the electricity workers, industrial painters, welders, carpenters, and countless other manual workers. It's really socialism 101 that these are the workers that have the skills, knowledge, and potential power to transform these systems of production like no other actor. And yet, it's precisely these workers who are, as you probably know, quite resistant to the climate agenda. And in fact, these kinds of workers have been shifting to the right in droves, right? It's these workers that often recoil at a kind of progressive, particularly progressive neoliberal agenda that really has done nothing but hollow out and deindustrialize a lot of communities for decades. So let me give a concrete example of this. Last fall, I was in Copenhagen, actually, meeting with some of the most committed and passionate climate justice activists in the country. During our meetings, I heard much about the need for solidarity with the Global South and indigenous peoples, but Denmark had just had an election, and actually the election went very poorly for the left and for climate justice advocates. Some reporting in Jacobin suggests that masses of industrial workers in the Danish wind industry were shifting to the right-wing parties, right? So wind workers for the right, okay? Meanwhile, the climate justice activists are kind of quarantined in these kind of very cosmopolitan, hip urban enclaves, and they're pretty much unaware that they're losing the very workers that we need for this energy transition, right? Okay, so second, the first point is we don't have these industrial workers. The second point is that this climate justice coalition is just simply a minority of many of our capitalist societies. Highly educated knowledge workers are not the majority of the working class, and the most oppressed and marginalized frontline communities are also not the majority of the working class. So climate justice politics often enacts what George Hoare called a kind of moral minoritarianism. Again, a morally righteous politics, but a politics that tends to only appeal to the already converted. And too often in left spaces, I see a lot of kind of preaching to the choir of ideas that everyone agrees with, but it's not clear how that reaches outward, right, to the broader masses. So I think we really need to appeal maybe less to abstract ideas of justice, or even, appealing to believe the science, as Sabrina was just talking about, of impending disaster. As the Gilets jaunes movement, and that'll be my French speaking for the the Gilets jaunes movement, they said politicians only care about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. right? So rent, energy costs, transportation costs, food cost. We're going through a cost of living crisis. And I think it's actually highly convenient that most of the sectors that we need to transform to solve climate change, that we need to decarbonize, are precisely these same material needs that working class people struggle to access at the end of the month. We need to transform energy and electricity. We need to transform housing, transit. These are working class needs. So what I argue is we really need a broader appeal to what I call proletarian ecology, which is the fact that most working class people, their livelihood is based on this kind of insecurity of trying to live through the market, right? And how the market does not guarantee a secure access of life itself, an ecological life, that is. And that's those end of month struggles. So let me close by suggesting that if the Climate Justice Coalition lacks power, what is it good for? On this front, I think we need to be a little serious about who is actually gaining from this coalition. And it seems to me it's actually not mostly poor and marginalized communities and poor groups themselves. The gains are flowing to the professional class. And for this, I'm trying to differentiate what Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner recently, they kind of argued that we should think about two different types of politics, class politics and material politics. And for them, class politics actually contests for power against capital, right? You know, a really serious power struggle. But material politics to them is really just aims to kind of improve one's own individual occupational or material life chances or conditions, right? And I would argue much of what goes on under the name of climate environmental justice is more of this latter kind of material politics. In fact, it appears that notions of climate environmental justice recently appear uniquely unthreatening to the ruling class interest. Jeff Bezos, we all love Jeff, you know, we had Chris Smalls here. He has something called an Earth Fund that recently granted $300 million to 43 grants to environmental justice NGOs. Goldman Sachs has funded a startup that's called Block Power. It leases heat pumps and other green infrastructure to poor working class residents with really dubious promises of cost savings. And they're able to sell the gains of this as new commodities that they've created, Block Power, that they're called environmental justice carbon offset tokens that they can sell to people wanting to offset their kind of carbon guilt. The Biden administration has recently established the Environmental Justice Council, and the Inflation Reduction Act is showering some $60 billion in investments in environmental justice communities. Yet we really should ask, is this money going to reach poor and oppressed people? So far, I'm not entirely convinced. A recently announced EPA program in environmental justice pledges $100 million to environmental justice, $30 billion of which will be exclusively for grants that go to nonprofits, 70 billion of which, 70 million with an M, 70 million for state, local, and tribal governments that work with nonprofits. So all of this money is basically a transfer to the kind of NGO industrial complex. Meanwhile, most marginalized and frontline communities are still disproportionately harmed by climate change and toxic fossil infrastructure. And the real beneficiaries of these movements are not the marginalized themselves, but the lawyers, the nonprofit staff, the wealthy foundation funders that run these climate organizations, often with really great intentions, it must be said. As Marx would say of these marginalized groups, Karl Marx, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented by NGO professional staffers. So the environmental and climate justice money train also, I think, infiltrates my domain, which is critical academic research. As someone in a field that might be called critical environmental studies, I've noticed that virtually every tenure track secure material job that comes on the market in my field contains these words: climate justice, environmental justice. These types of jobs are easily approved by deans and elite administrators that are kind of fresh off like DEI trainings and all this kind of diversity stuff. So on the academic front, marginalized groups are not the targets of NGO advocacy, but they're the kind of like the objects of study where ambitious tenured and tenure track academics jet in to extract data from often heroic struggles of these oppressed groups. This data becomes the basis for securing publications and tenure and material security. Again, material politics, not class politics. And it's not that this kind of work on pollution, environmental injustice, agrarian land dispossession, some of this work is brilliant, really important, but I think there's this kind of disproportionate attention to this kind of work that's sort of elevating academic careers as opposed to the marginalized themselves. And my book really aims to show that if we want to win the climate struggle, it's not just about land dispossession, pollution, injustice, and harm, but it's again about seizing industrial forms of production. So let me close in conclusion to just reaffirm we are weak and we are losing. And there's a planet that we need to win. And if we truly want to win climate justice for frontline communities, we need a strategy that erodes the power of capital. And for that, I humbly believe that Marxism, it's sort of basic to Marxism, that there's no force in society better than a well-organized working class to win that power. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Here we are welcoming Mohamed Amer Meziane. He is a philosopher and a musician. He is currently an assistant professor at Brown University and a senior fellow at the Freie Universität in Berlin. He holds a PhD from the University of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and has been teaching for 4 years at Columbia University. He also serves as a board member of the journal Multitude. His first book, Des Empires sous la Terre, proposes an ecological and racial history of secularization. It examines how disenchantment was engendered by empire and led to climate change. More specifically, his work analyzes the neglected connection between imperial forms of secularization and fossil capital by examining the colonization of land and subterranean worlds, especially during the 19th century. Questioning the assumption of the turn to the non-humans on both arts and theory, his second book, Au bord des mondes, challenges dominant ecological thinking by arguing that there can be no decolonization of knowledge without a critical engagement with metaphysics. Here we welcome Mohamed Amer Meziane.
There you go. You hear me now, right? So hello, everyone. So of course, I'd like to first thank the organizers of this wonderful and quite outstanding conference. Thank you all for coming because, it's Sunday. I would like to, begin by saying a few words about precisely these days, right? Because it's the closing, the last conference, and something about the collective which has been created over the past few days. In my view, from my perspective, one of the central questions that sort of emerged is the overlap, the potential, the possible overlaps between anti-colonial perspectives on the one hand and anti-capitalist perspective on the other, which from the point of view of both strategy and theory also means the possible convergence between decolonial and Marxist theoretical tradition. And I think this is precisely what we need in terms both of theory and in terms of political and strategic practices. This means, in my view, that we have to criticize and find ways to counter both capitalism and coloniality. But this means, and this would be my first point, that we can't reduce colonialism to capitalism or avoid the question of capitalism through or via coloniality. The problem, in my view, is that too much of the literature on climate, but also too much of the literature on eco-Marxism and decoloniality, in fact, does precisely this, that is to say, either separate both or reduce one to another. And in my view, the reduction of colonialism to capitalism or capitalism to coloniality is impossible because it is as problematic as the reduction of class to race and of race to class. So I would argue, and this is something I would like to discuss with you and the panelists here, that the repoliticization of the climate question requires the synthesis, the bridging, the unification of anti-capitalist and anti-colonialist tradition in light of the climate crisis. Because in other words, if eco-Marxism reduces colonialism to capitalism, it will probably fall into the trap of colonial and Eurocentric forms of knowledge and Eurocentric forms of Marxism. On the other hand, if decolonials ignore the relationship, the structural relationship between coloniality and capitalism, which sometimes they actually do, they will become unconscious agents, or they might become unconscious agents of neoliberal thinking. So what I would like to, begin with is that we'll try, not that I'm going to do it because this is a task and a collective task, but try to reconcile Marxism and decoloniality via the climate question. And this is a third path that I would like to explore with you today. But before I begin, I will begin somewhere else, that is to say, by referring to the title, right? Repoliticizing the climate question. Well, the first thing about the title is that it presupposes that different things depoliticize the climate question. So I will first start with sort of trying to analyze what exactly depoliticizes the climate question. Well, the first thing, and I think it was mentioned by both of you, is the notion of individual responsibility. And I would just like to mention something that might be used as a tool sometimes, which is that the very notion of the carbon footprint, right? In fact, is a word that is coined by the communication agency Ogilvy and Mather, which was actually recruited by British Petroleum, that is to say, one of the largest oil companies worldwide. Which means that when someone says to you, well, what about your carbon footprint? Well, they're just like, in fact, deploying a communication strategy, which directly comes from fossil capitalism, which of course nurtures this notion that we are individually responsible. The second, and I'm sure we'll talk about that because I think it's a central question in both your presentation, is a certain conception of science and a certain conception of technoscience. I wholeheartedly agree with both of you with the fact that we certainly don't have to abandon the notion that we are practicing critical science. We are, right? But however, the depoliticization of the climate question comes from the fact that the dominant practice and model of what we call science is not what we are doing, right? That's right, empiricism. Thank you. Partly empiricism, no worries. I mean, this is starting the discussion. The third thing, of course, which, is a banality, but it's worth quoting or mentioning, is, of course, this notion of an undifferentiated responsibility of humanity at large, right? Which, of course, the notion of the Anthropocene is famously part of. But I want to add something a bit more polemical, maybe, is that what also depoliticizes the climate question today is the assumption that to solve the climate crisis, we have to recognize the humanity of non-humans, right? Why is it a form of depoliticization? Precisely because it is not because animals and plants do not have souls for us that we are facing the climate crisis. What causes capitalist extractivism on a global scale is not, in fact, the simple fact that plants and animals are not seen as humans, right? So it doesn't mean to say that this has no part to play in the repoliticization of the climate question. But once again, if we only think about extractivism as only a way of inhabiting the earth and a way of not recognizing, the non-humans, if we forget colonial capitalism by doing this, then we are participating in the depoliticization of the climate question. Now, the last factor, in my view, is something which I would like to talk more about right now, is very simple. That is to say, the depoliticization of the climate question comes from the marginalization or the erasure of the central role of the modern state in the making of the climate crisis. And I want to say already that that the modern imperial state is not reducible to capitalism and is not reducible to colonialism, because the modern imperial state is precisely in our world what monopolizes what we call politics. So if we don't put the state and the analysis, critical analysis of the state at the center of how we raise the climate question, then it means that you can actually depoliticize the climate question. That is to say, a more indirect depoliticization of the climate question happens when we assume that climate change is only about economy, right, or modes of production, and not centrally, and I insist on centrally, about gender violence, systemic racism, and of course, the organization of politics via the nation state, right? So let me just, put a word on that, which is that if there is a fossil capital, and if there is a fossil imperialism, it's also because there is a fossil state. And the fossil state connects both colonialism and capitalism without being reducible to either the former or the latter, right? So let me maybe take an example which has to do with what I'm trying to say, and to some extent with my positionality, but who cares about that? The word is Sainte-Soline, right? You've heard of that, no? Yes, you did, probably. Which is something that happened in France a few months ago, which in my view is quite historical, which is the organization of actually peaceful protests led by climate activists from different parts of the world, not just in France, which were in fact contesting the making of what is called mega bassine. I guess you could call it the mega water reservoirs in rural France. Now, what I want to talk about is not the project itself, it's counter-insurrection, because before we can think about strategies, you have to think about how you're going to counter-insurrection, because it will come. And the problem is that, of course, what we're facing is about private companies, it's about private oil companies, it's about the private, it's about capitalists, it's about capitalist class. But when you're going to act politically, the first instance you're going to face is the state and military and police violence. Now, why do I mention the example of Sainte-Soline? Well, it's because of systemic racism and Islamophobia. Why? Because the ways in which the state responded materially to this climate movement, but also ideologically to this climate movement, was in fact by comparing climate activists to Islamic terrorists, right? Which means here that a certain form of systemic racism participates in the moral, political legitimization of how climate activism is being repressed. So unless and until there will be a clear position on systemic racism, and specifically on Islamophobia, that is to say the racialization of so-called religion in Western public spheres, the interactions between anti-racist movements and climate activist movements will be incomplete. I guess I have 2 minutes. So what is this will be my last point. What I bring to the table, so to speak, is a historical perspective, right? To the extent that this, counter-insurrectional strategy I'm talking about, of course, is located, and it doesn't work in the same way in everywhere, and certainly not exactly in the same way in the global South. But however, we have to go back before 9/11 to sort of write the sort of long history of where we are now, right? The kind of politics, the kind of relations of power which are at stake in the depoliticization and the repoliticization of the climate question. And this word, which I will end with, is, whether we like it or not, for the lack of a better word, secularization, or rather imperial secularization. So just to the Marxist friends, the only thing I'm trying to say is that Marx himself, or the Marxist tradition, in my view, has failed to see something which I think we should see, is that imperial secularization is a central aspect of the original accumulation of capital. State violence, the expropriation of land, the expropriation of subsoils is linked to the expropriation of the churches, all kinds of religious communities, the integration of what is called religion within the body of the state. And whether we like it or not, this is part of what's going on, right? As much as colonialism and as much as race. Now, of course, what we're going to do politically with that is an open-ended question, and I will leave it to the discussion with my colleagues and comrades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So I will start the next block by asking you for a consent. Everybody, we started a little late. It is the last one. Can we give ourselves an extra 15 minutes to weave in all that we said we wanted to do with this séance? Can you 15, no more, no more. The translators have been working hard, but thank you. Thank you. Hence, I have prepared some questions that, of course, you feel free to weave. I will start with Sabrina. You mentioned also, well, today and in some of your papers, how in the relationship with time, and yet the impossibility to some antagonism with capitalism that's evident and obvious, but also the fact that, well, the probability of capitalism to disappear totally in the next, per se, 25 years, well, sounds like an ambitious presumption. Hence, there might be some gains that can be done within the context of capitalism, but that would distinguish themselves from false solutions and other scams by raising the possibility of ruptures with dignity. I would invite you to share more about that if you want. Yeah.
Thank you, Maude. Yes, so the issue with the contradiction of time is that we are dealing with very tight deadlines to try to avoid the worst type of outcomes connected to climate change. And I'm very pessimistic usually when I see the actual metrics around the commitments that have been made and the actual policy that was implemented and the actual outcome of those policies. You can always say that talking about 1.5 seems ridiculous to me. Like we're moving way beyond that, moving beyond 2.0 actually in terms of the average temperature increase for the planet. And this means also that the action that we need to take right now is not just to avoid going over 2.0, but also to deal with things that we don't know that are coming. Because a lot of the models in terms of predictability of the impacts of climate change, they go until a certain point, but you have the compounding effects connected to the larger ecological crisis at all. So loss of biodiversity, what's happening with soil fertility, issues around food sovereignty, issues around migration, and so on. So we have something that's about to pile up in terms of a poly-crisis getting worse and worse. But in leftist strategy, when we say then, wow, we need to act now and we need to implement big projects connected to fighting climate change now, sometimes there comes that accusation, well, that sounds very reformist. because how come you're talking about doing things that you need to overthrow capitalism? And sometimes I just say, well, it's kind of obvious, but we also need to deal with an emergency plan. David Schwartzman has talked about it in those terms as like an emergency plan for the planet, while we build conditions for other things. And I think there's like a very important criteria here to differentiate doing action now and falling into the trap of green capitalism or thinking we can actually solve things under capitalism, and building something that will have effects now, knowing that we need to take on radical action as well, which is private property. If we are dealing with the issue of property in our projects right now, we are putting dents on both sides. So coming from a perspective of trying to increase quality of life for people in a way that will make people look into green projects and see them as desirable, reducing the labor week is probably a good idea. Trying to increase our reach into the commons, so like common spaces, talking about a new economy of care that actually deals with social reproductive conflicts. Those things, they target how value is produced in our society in ways that change people's lives for the better now. So it helps to bring them in through concerns that may be material, but also change reconfigurations in society around the actual power around class politics. One thing that I always mention around time in terms of reducing the work week is that it actually gives people time to organize as well. A lot of people don't get organized because they're being ground into powder every single day, right? So there are certain criteria that we can implement to making sure that we are acting now, but also building conditions for more radical organizing and targeting capitalism at its core, and maybe building something closer to revolutionary power towards a post-capitalist society, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Building on this, Matt, those criteria, because like it's again a rhythm thing in terms of the kind of advantageous situation of some of the workers of the big industries, which at least in some countries have good conditions to a certain extent. Like they're not. And what has to happen in criteria of where we have to get at timely. How to reach both that level of ambition and the endorsement of those workers in a timely manner. And obviously, I think it involves some grief in terms of the levels of comfort, perhaps, or something.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we're in a bit of a impasse because we're not, as I tried to convey, we're not actually embarking on the large scale transformation, a great transition, if you will, a large scale transformation of our industrial energy systems at the speed that we would require to solve the problem. So because, it becomes then an abstract discussion of, net zero targets and this by 2030 and this by 20 or whatever, oftentimes the narrative kind of just focuses on the fact that many of the workers you mentioned in this industrial system, particularly the fossil fuel workers, are going to be put out of work. Hillary Clinton famous said, we're going to put coal communities out of work. And there becomes this sort of imaginary of deindustrialization accompanying the climate transition, which for these workers who many of which, as you say, have pretty decent jobs and good conditions, find extremely threatening. But what the point I would make is that if we actually were to embark on this large scale transformation, if we were building new public transit systems, building new green retrofitted public housing, if we were building a new transmission grid system, all that building would be just in the naked self-interest of these very workers that we need to get on board. And I think if we come to those workers with a different message that actually, you know, there's, as Sabrina was pointing out, there's a project underway called green capitalism, and it wants to just break union power, break the workers' power over these systems and move to this kind of Wall Street-led renewable, you know, anti-union capitalism, right? So we have to really make the case that, you know, they are unionized, they have good jobs, and we want to expand good jobs for everyone. And we want to expand their power over this transition. And if they don't, and we have to make the case if they aren't organizing proactively to be at the core of this transition, they're going to be sort of swept away by this green capitalism. So, but again, they're not going to really see the climate transition as something good unless we're actually doing it, right? So it's a real chicken and egg problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Weaving on those, Mohamed, you were inviting on what at some point I understood it. We were getting to like the strategic corollaries of what you propose as a mind frame or as a theoretical frame. Weaving was named in terms of demands within the system that makes sense in a revolutionary perspective, and how we can catalyze it to happen in a timely manner. How do you feel what you're proposing can weave into that?
You hear me? Yes. Okay. Well, that's a broad but good question. Well, the first thing I want to say is that, and I think it was said by you, Sabrina, is about transnationalism and cosmopolitanism. I guess one of the first thing I want to say is a reminder that to put the nation state in the critical as a critical target is also a way of reminding ourselves that we need to sort of organize transnationally and beyond the sort of framework. But I think the state is both a physical and a metaphysical beast, right? That is to say that it comes with different, not only ideologies, but also ways of living, ways of thinking that actually, as modern subjects, we have completely embodied, right? I'll come back to the strategic dimension of that just in a minute. I just wanted to also remind something that probably all of you know, but just to bring it back to the conversation, is that what we call a revolution, and you know, that was the sort of structuring question of Marx writing, is that you need to organize, but you need a crisis. You need to organize in the crisis, and we need to sort of analyze how a certain kind of crisis from the point of view of fossil fuel industries, because I think that actually fossil capitalism is in crisis, especially oil. The oil economy. And the thing is about how do you act and organize in the midst of a crisis, which is, I think, a different question of this is how we have to organize. The third thing I want to say, the third point I want to raise is an example that comes to my mind about something that, you know, you're also engaged with in the different kind of collectives that you're participating in, is, and very central in general in Canada and in America more broadly, is the question of how climate activists can make productive and revolutionary, in fact, alliances with indigenous communities, right? And I think that this bridge alliance is not only reducible to something which has to do with settler colonialism and race. Of course it is. Of course it is, right? But I'm saying it's not only this. Why? Because if you only see indigenous people as racialized people, there is something you won't see, which is their traditions and the way they reclaim their lands, the earth, via a certain kind of, whether you like it or not, spiritual traditions, right? In which the earth is not only the earth as we think of as nature, but the earth as something which is cosmic, but also linked to metaphysical forces. And I want to say something about the law, which is, you know, what happened in New Zealand about the river Wanganui, if I remember correctly, which is interesting about the text of the law, right? is that the river is recognized by the law, not only as a physical or natural entity, right? It's both its physical and metaphysical properties which are recognized by the law. And of course, I'm saying this because I know it's a trouble, because it's something that, despite all good intentions on the side of climate activists, which, as you said, are let's say, educated and majority white, sometimes, but not always, or maybe less and less, also urban classes. And one of the things about the bourgeois ideology, which is something that, in my view, Marxism has seen a little bit, but not sufficiently addressed, is that they're secularized, and some of them secularists, right? And it's good, it's fine, you know. Of course, sometimes religion is bad, no doubt, but human institutional religions, right? If you just say, oh, religions are bad, you're a pure idealist, right? Because it doesn't exist, right? It's humans in a specific time and space who have power via certain kind of institutions. You can't generalize, right? And the fact is, something that makes these revolutionary, as you say, alliances with indigenous communities, something that makes it difficult or more difficult, is that metaphysics for us is just bad, right? And this is the kind of question I'm trying to raise, if you like, right?
Thank you. I can give you, now is the time where you can bounce on on each other's, and then we're going to open to the public. All right. So you want to go? Here you go.
Yes, have question/comment for my colleagues. So met under marginalized/frontline communities. The fact that a lot of these NGOs, and when I'm talking about NGOs, that's like the ones with money, right? That can come in and do these big projects and fill up these voids in the communities. I think obviously they do that because they have resources, yes. But would it also be because that void is also left by leftist organizing that sometimes comes in with certain paradigms around values, politics, priorities for the communities, and there is a clash? And just to clarify what I mean by this, is usually, for example, around sacrifice zones, right? So talking about communities that are living under the impact of activities that sometimes are very valued by a certain sector of the left, that we need this industry here, we need this to happen, and the communities kind of develop some level of resentment, or just like they don't trust the left to be able to be loyal and value what's happening to them, without just saying, no, we'll help you with some compensation, but you just have to deal with this because this is important for development, or this is important for our own paradigm around industry. So if you can make a comment on that. And do I say they went to Mohamed now as well?
You can, it's just going to be like a bit of a speeches thing.
Yeah.
If you want to get there. So it's all good. I'm sorry, it's that thing of time here. Like I'm the guardian of time, but like, yeah, you can definitely go, just each other be
My whole thing is just like on the state matter, right? Is that I absolutely agree with the fact that I thought it was really nice how you put it too, like the state, the fossil state connecting capitalism and colonialism here. But also we have this problem of time, and the state is very useful for getting some stuff done that we need to get done in terms of infrastructure, right? How do we handle that?
So Matt, you want to go first, and then you can think about it. Yeah.
I can respond and then maybe raise some other, So, I think what you bring up is really a real problem, and the void you talk about, I think is real, that, we've lived in about 50, maybe 40 years of this kind of neoliberal hollowing out of state capacity, but also just a complete crushing of left power generally. and particularly the power of labor movement. And so I've drawn a lot from an essay in Catalyst on sort of NGOism. They call it the politics of the third sector. And what they do talk about is how these kind of NGOs have sort of come to drive a lot of left politics, and they're very different than the kind of older mass membership organizations that drove the left in the early mid 20th century, like unions and left parties. And so NGOs, as you said, are more top down. They're foundation funded, so they're ultimately linked to sort of rich people, and they're bureaucratic, and they're not particularly democratic. And so the way in which they fill this void that's been, there's no state capacity, so NGOs can come in and start to do that kind of crucial work of providing even welfare services, resilience to communities devastated by all sorts of capitalist dispossession. And so in some cases, it's like better than nothing to have them there, but there's also kind of, there's not sure how they're linked into broader political projects. And I think this is quite interesting in the conflicts in Latin America right now, where you actually do have powerful political parties that are winning for the left and winning state power. But then, as you're saying, like sometimes these states, I'm thinking in like Bolivia, want to do big extractive projects, and you have groups that are opposing that. And then you might get these NGOs sort of in between, and it becomes quite difficult how to parse like which side are we on in these struggles. But I think like these left parties that have actually got significant power, need to think much more deeply about how to really democratize decisions over extraction and production, and find ways to, NGOism talks in terms of communities always, and I find that a bit problematic, because a lot of these indigenous and frontline communities are not homogenous entities. They are highly differentiated. They have inequalities and power structures within. And so how to negotiate those groups in very complicated and democratic ways is a real challenge. So I'll just stop there, but I did want to, I wanted to kind of push a little on the idea of false solutions that you brought up, Sabrina, because I think too often when we say false solutions, we talk about just particular technologies, like maybe green hydrogen, or maybe something like direct air capture. But what I worry about is it's often capitalists who are promoting these false solutions. And the falsity to me is that we should trust these capitalists to really invest in these at a reasonable scale that we need. But I sometimes wonder if we're throwing out the technological baby with the bathwater, and that if we could imagine different social relations of technology for something like green hydrogen, or even something like Holly Jean Buck's work on like a public utility carbon removal program that's actually removing carbon as a public good. Like, can we imagine different social relations of technological control that would push back the falsity of capital, right? And then for Mohamed, just quickly, I wondered just how you think about, obviously there is these traditions of Marxism that maybe sometimes reproduce imperialist types of structures, but I just wonder how you think about the kind of more internal to Marxism, discussions on imperialism. I mean, the fact that a lot of what you talked about in terms of expropriation and colonialism is right in the pages of volume 1 on primitive accumulation. And Marx really thought seriously about how this kind of expropriation was sort of foundational to capitalism. And then particularly how Marxism developed as a world-changing project and actually had theories of imperialism and debated those theories, and how those Marxist theories of imperialism sort of shape your thinking.
Thank you. Okay. Well, the state first, and these two questions are connected. The first thing I want to say is that I'm not talking about all states or the state per se. I'm talking about the states as they are today, right? The states of the states. And the state of the states today is linked to imperialism, empire, more generally, maybe even. And it has to do with a certain kind of sovereignty, right? Theological, political kind of sovereignty, by which states are, in fact, little gods on earth, or claim to be always. Why? Because of the structure of the sovereignty, that is to say, there is no power beyond me. That is, me is not me, of course, but the state. Second thing is, we are in the state, right? It's not the government. I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking about the state, and we're citizens of states. I hope for most of us. If you're not, this is called hell on earth, right? And the state is heaven on earth, but when you're outside, it's hell. It's funny, but these are not just metaphors, but this is for another time. So it means that we're inside of the state, right? By which I mean, I'm not trying to say, I'm not an anarchist, in other words, like, let's get rid of the state and then we'll find a solution to climate, the climate crisis. Nonsense, right? But we have to, if we have to organize, it means that we organize within a state. And if the states are to legislate, right, to help solve the climate crisis, because this is what you say, right? It's useful. Well, the thing is that with states is that they don't do that by themselves. They tend to be quite deaf, right? So it means that you can only force states to act, right? Which means that you have to create, and this is also the question you were raising, and to some extent, Matt, is the question of how do you, have power, right? Because it's also linked to a power, you construct a power relationship that will force the state to do something. Unless you think about I'm sorry to say that, but the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Which in my view is something that Marx abandoned at the end of his life for good reasons, I think.
Interesting.
Right? Because the state is not just an instrument, right? That if the working class takes over the state, it will not just take an instrument, it will take something that might also instrumentalize them. Hence the fact that dictatorship of the proletariat is still a dictatorship. By which I mean that there is something about the tradition and the legacy of the commune, right? Which is something else, which is also exactly the kind of experience that made Marx question the strategy of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Which means that precisely you have to sort of organize as a quasi-state within the state, which is a situation not only of class struggle, but can degenerate into class war, civil war. Because the question of war and warfare is at stake. If it's not political, right? Or you think that you're going to come and say, look, state, you have to act because you have to act now. I mean, they're going to do, as you both described, a form or participate in what you call green capitalism, right? The other thing, and it relates to something you insisted on, Sabrina, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, which is not only transnationalism, but cosmopolitanism, right? So same thing, if we resolve the problem domestically, it means that we didn't solve the problem, right? So it means that if we could, but we can't for now, right? Organize something which would be both below and beyond the nation states and have an organization of, powerful enough transnationally to deploy another kind of sovereignty as this kind of imperial sovereignty, then yes, we could say that we would have a certain kind of power. And the last thing I wanted to say is, of course, about imperialism, which is going to lead me to your very important question, is, look, I'm going to say it very boldly and simply. Public opinion doesn't give a damn about imperialism, right? So if you tell me there is a way of making the public opinion care about that, which is also going to mean care about the fact that most of the time imperialism is, if not fossil imperialism, ecocidal imperialism, then it means that we're going to, go in the direction of, I wouldn't say the solution, but the solutions, right? We have to sort of articulate different solutions. I'm not saying I have the answer, and there is an emergency for sure. And we might fail also, and we're actually failing because we don't know, because we're powerless, and because there is, it's one of the biggest crises of humanity. We might not have a solution because we're just human beings after all. And we thought of the fact that, oh, we produce the problem, then we will have the solution. Maybe not, because this is part of anthropocentrism as well. Last thing about imperialism. Yes, I mean, I don't know, it's not a joke, but yes, I mean, it's funny too, but maybe. Imperialism, Marxism, expropriation. Okay. Very briefly, because I'm long, but I won't ask questions. Yes, of course, there is a Marxist anti-imperialism, no doubt. But this is why I was sort of emphasizing, right, this question of secularization, because I agree with you. As soon as you look at the texts about original or primitive accumulation of capital, to some extent, all the most interesting anti-colonialist theory is already sort of in potential there. 100% agree with you, right? And this is why, to some extent, what is not completely clear in the analysis of primitive accumulation in capital, in Capital One, is precisely this notion of secularization. That is to say, the connection between land expropriation and the expropriation of the churches, right? Just to take a very simple example, coal, right? Many of the reserves of coal that were present in England, in Britain, right, were in fact property of the churches, right? And it means that what happened is that, in fact, these churchmen, I don't defend the church, by the way. I'm not Christian. I'm not blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is not about that. It's about an analysis, right? And the thing is that they were not extracting coal massively, because there was a limitation actually of the level of coal that you could extract. And at the time, it was for domestic uses, right? And what is called the beginning, in fact, and I agree with that, among some eco-Marxists, which is called the Elizabethan leap, right, which is supposed to be the sort of starting point, is precisely the moment when there is a secularization, a reappropriation of these land by the state. And when I say imperial state, I mean the imperial British state, which is also secularizing itself, also because it creates a church which is submitted to the state, right? So the church is actually a part of the organism of the state. And what happens is that this means that the coal, which by that time is not used as a fossil fuel, right? Is in fact appropriated by the state. So there is a principle of public ownership, if you'd like, of underground resources and natural resources. And in the case of England, this is going to produce, in fact, the market, if you like, because they're going to sell these underground and land properties belonging to A, farmers, but B, also churchmen. They're going to sell them and to put it as, if you'd like, commodities on a private market, right? You know what I mean? And if you look at France, for example, by the beginning of the 19th century, what the French imperial state did under Napoleon was precisely to implement this notion, not only the notion of a public property of the natural resources and the subsoil, the system of commission, right? That is to say, you give, and this is how you have this sort of alliance between private companies and state companies. Hence also the fact that, many oil companies are, one of the most, among the most disastrous, and not only in the West, in fact, of course, are state-owned or state majority-owned companies, right? So it means that this is part of the problem as much as it can be part of the solution. So it's which state we're talking about, and how do we act in a space where it's the state that sort of dominates still now what we call power relationships, right? Or just power, right? This is what I mean.
Interesting. Thank you. So I understand if you have to leave, but we're going to give ourselves the time for question and Q&A. Invite everyone to a stretch. We just had a lot of. Can you answer it with? We're going to take like maybe like 2 or 3 questions in a row. Obviously, please be concise so we can have more room for the answers. And I invite you to share your commentaries in another context and focus on the question aspect of your intervention, please. Thank you.
Hi there. I just want to say I appreciate the panel's central statement that to get rid of climate change and all that's around it, you have to get rid of capital or the state capital in the case of Mohamed, maybe. But I just want to express my surprise that you not really mentioned anything about getting rid of, for example, war, which is, like the idea of pacifism versus the climate. I think war is very bad for the environment, especially nuclear war. But also, maybe I just want to give the panel an opportunity to express what kind of hope you have in terms of the future of climate politics with the rise of China and as a new global hegemon, or at least the rise of the multipolar world. So that's my question.
Thank you. In a gender, because I think we can only have 2, because that was a bit. I'm sorry. We're never going to be done. Maybe 3. Let's have 3. So please, just I leave with you with a gender. Maybe out. No. Yeah.
Je vous promets que je vais être très bref. D'abord, j'aimerais faire un commentaire.
No.
Tantôt, on a cité Marx, et moi, je vais citer Marx aussi. Marx disait que la religion est l'opium du peuple, et s'il était en vie maintenant, il dirait que la spiritualité est l'opium du peuple. Ça résume mon opinion. Maintenant, j'ai une question aux 3 panélistes. On a énuméré beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de tâches, mais pour reprendre une terminologie qu'on n'utilise plus beaucoup maintenant, y a-t-il une contradiction principale et y a-t-il un aspect principal de la contradiction? Autrement dit, qu'est-ce qui serait vraiment prioritaire dans toute la liste incroyable des aspects que vous avez mentionnés sur lesquels il faudrait travailler pour amener un changement au niveau climatique?
Hi, everyone. First, I wanted to say I'm a student of this university, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity and this conference. I have a quick question for each one of you.
Please, just one.
One? Okay. Yeah. Sure. I'll go with Sabrina then. I'm also a UN civil society observer. So I've been a lot to UNFCCC and COPs and everything. And I really agree with you that it's basically green capitalism in a lot of ways. But I remember South American climate activists saying, if we talk about energy, because it's a really big question right now, a sustainable energy transition for who and at what cost? Because if we talk about renewable energies, if we talk about solar panels, it's a lot of lithium mining in South America. And do you see a way that we can divest from fossil fuel and in a way that is not harmful to other local communities in these countries? And do you think it's about expanding solar renewables in another way, or is there another alternative? Thank you.
Merci. Je passe au français. Je vais essayer d'être plus inclusif. Vous avez droit à un mot chacun, puis là, on va repasser au truc. Sinon, on ne va pas respecter le temps. Fait que si vous avez un mot clé d'une chose, vous pouvez y aller. Ouais, vous 3, that's that. Un mot.
What about degrowth or green growth?
Un mot.
Hello.
C'est bon. Mot-clé. Keyword.
Si on arrive au consensus que les COP sont un espace qui fait la promotion du capitalisme vert, est-ce qu'il ne serait pas le temps de les boycotter?
how do we resolve this perhaps false binary or some kind of binary between indigenous methodologies and positive, the we believe the science kind of climate advocacy?
Thank you. Well done.
I want to raise the issue of COP17 and the refusal of some environmentalists to join and show solidarity with political prisoners in Egypt and the relation between political prisoners and environmental and climate change issues.
All right, so it's going to be very quick answers. I invite you to just welcome those questions. We're not going to solve everything today. We're going to leave with questions. That was bound to happen. That was a given. It's going to be. So let's celebrate that. And I give you a last turn. It's like it's not going to be satisfying. I'm sorry. But this a last turn and life will go on and we'll move and live with these questions and talk about it again in 2 years at the next great transition.
All right. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna connect questions and see if it works. So I think the question on the impacts of the energy stuff and degrowth and techno fixes, they all kind of connect. So I think the issue with techno fixes is that they're dictated by market mechanisms and the big capitalists on top, in the sense that they show up as solutions that stall for things to stay the same. But it doesn't mean that the technologies behind them precisely are only meant for that. And I would go a little backwards and just say that one of the problems that we have is that a lot of the technologies connected to transition are being developed within the private company framework. There are green patents, they are filed all of the time. And we have issues in curriculum. Like we're still forming a lot of people to work with oil and gas and not so much to work in other areas. And that creates even resistance in terms of how are we going to transition our jobs and things like that. So my issue with the tech here would be understanding scale and temporality. So like CCS, for example, is something that the IPCC says it might be important for stability, but not necessarily for transition, because it has a lot of issues around technical maturity. So I think one of the conflicts that I have around a lot of these conversations around technology is that sometimes people are talking about right now things that might really work in 20 or 30 years, but in terms of implementation, in the time scale, but also in terms of the cost, is not that feasible right now. And then there's this matter of green colonialism and the rush for minerals, the creation of new sacrifice zones that would require for us to maybe make other adjustments in life so we don't have to get so dependent on new tech and new resources. In that sense, a conversation around tactical degrowth might be interesting for us here, as much as I know that we're not going to exhaust this conversation right now. On COP27, I was connected to the campaign for Free Allah, and I think we got some bells out of it, but unfortunately, we were not able to free Allah. So we have a lot of work to still do in terms of internationalism and our campaigns against authoritarianism and political prisoners, and the level of greenwashing that's being done of authoritarianism right now through the COPs. Though I don't think we should boycott the COPs just yet. They're like, we still, if we're not making huge progress, sometimes we're losing less because we're still making a presence in that space. And I think I didn't answer everything, but I'm going to pass it along to my colleagues.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. First question about war, I think is a really important one. One of the most polluting entities in the world is the Pentagon. And there's been real good research showing that if you want to talk about carbon footprints, let's talk about the war machine's carbon footprint. And it's insane. And it's quite disturbing to think about the ways in which fossil capital aligned with a kind of military industrial complex and really powered a kind of industrial warfare that could lead to the kind of mass killing we've seen around the world over the last 100 years in particular. So, you mentioned David Schwartzman. He's also been on this, if climate justice means fighting the military industrial complex and imperialism at the same time. So I'm all on board. I've been really sort of interested in this analysis that Mohamed is providing in terms of secularization, and the question brought up Marx's famous quote about the opium of the people. And I'm not particularly like very new agey spiritual type of person, but I just want to say that it's very clear that we have a kind of crisis with the natural world that is not just an instrumental crisis. It's a crisis of a kind of spirituality that we are lacking, a kind of developing a kind of a relation of sacredness with the natural world that obviously we have a lot to learn from other cultures and other communities, indigenous communities that have developed much more reciprocal and relational, spiritual connections with the natural world. And so there has to be a space for that in repoliticizing the climate question. And that does go against that kind of, I think Marxists typically sort of celebrate secularization as sort of part of progress or whatever. Okay, degrowth versus green growth. I think, I'll draw a bit from, a famous degrowth analyst, Matthias Schmelzer, who wrote a whole book about really growth. How we understand it is an ideology of capitalism that really emerged in the post-war era. And sometimes I think this growth or degrowth is sort of like a debate that is on the ideological terms set forth by capitalism itself, which is really focused so intently on GDP growth and whether or not it's a statistical indicator of health of an economy or not. And what I think is what we need, and this sounds like a broken record, what we need is power. We need to seize these systems of production and shape them toward not profit, but toward social and ecological needs. And so if we can build up the kind of power to seize these systems of production, then I'm not really ready to say it must also accompany degrowth of material footprints, right? I think we have to decide collectively, how much do we need for energy? How much do we need for transportation? We need to make these decisions democratically. And Sabrina mentioned the 800 million people that lack electricity around the world. I'd also mention the over 1 billion people who suffer from totally preventable waterborne diseases and horrific levels of disease, and that just come from lack of investment in basic water sanitation systems that much of the world lacks. So my view is that if we were to actually have the power to seize and control production, we would actually want to grow a lot of things that I gotta stop. Yeah, okay. We want to grow a lot of things like that would be a part of a larger project of abolishing poverty and solving the climate crisis. So I don't want to say it, once we get production, then we just go down, degrow. No, I don't want to say that.
Thank you. Lots of stuff to think about. A last word from Mohamed.
Yes. OK.
C'était prévu jusqu'à 1h30, fait que je vous presse pour rien. C'est ça que vous dites? Oh!
Alors.
Ben c'est correct. So you do have it was still 1:30. I was confused. I thought it was 1. So I was like, oh my gosh. But
OK, so we have time.
We have time.
In that
All right,
case,
thank you.
in that case,
Sorry, I was like, they're going to be starving. All right.
OK.
Yeah.
OK, I'm just going to follow up and continue on what has been said about anti-war. Yes, absolutely. That is to say, and thank you for bringing the question, is one of the stakes of reminding us of how the state operates with and within capitalism is precisely to see that global warfare has been part of not only what sustains climate change, but what has also made the crisis itself, right? How it originated, right? Because a state doesn't exist with other states, it exists against other states, right? This is to say, imperial states are inter-imperial forces. They are against each other. by virtue of their essence, if you'd like, right? So it's an absolute power against another absolute power against another absolute power, which is, of course, the best road to total destruction, right? Unsustainable for that reason as well. So I think that if we do recover to a certain extent the kind of power that was, but I don't think it's the case right now anymore as much as it was, the kind of power that we were able to have, for example, in the 70s and so on, in the building of a real anti-war political global consciousness, then yes, that would be part, in fact, of a repoliticization of the climate question. Indeed, I think it's directly linked. Something about religion as the opium of the people. Well, I'm sorry to say that when Marx says that religion is the opium of the people, he is being messianic, hence religious. Why? Because when you say religion is the opium of the people, in fact, what you criticize, and this is something about which Marx was not materialist enough, not spiritualist, materialist enough, is that for religion to become the opium of the people, you have to have a secularized state and capitalism already. Because it comes from the fact that because religion is depoliticized, read the Jewish question, then you have a socialization and an individualization of quote unquote religion. This is what Marx says in the Jewish question, right? So the religion as the opium of the people is a late secular capitalist 19th century transformation of religion, hence secularization. B, if you want to say religion is bad because it's not a sufficiently revolutionary force, which is also what Marx argues, you have to say that the last shall be the first. This is a phrase of the Bible, becomes the expropriation of the expropriators. There is a conscious, Marx knows what he's doing. He's much more theological than you think. And it's precisely because he's an atheist that he is a theologian, because this is messianism. It's called heaven on earth, spiritual. Absolutely spiritual. Secondly, precisely because it's atheism, precisely. I know it's dialectical, but you know dialectics is important. Last thing, historical materialism, right? Thank you, historical materialism. This is like outstanding, great. I love you and I love historical materialism. But I have something to say about how to bridge, right? Indigenous, someone said that, like indigenous sort of cosmovisions and science on the other hand. Well, precisely, we need a sort of decolonization of knowledge here, right? Of knowledge production. It's not just like, oh, it's idealist, it's not going to, save us. The willingness to save humanity is great, but this is precisely messianic and spiritual. No problem, go for it, right? But stop saying that the others are too religious and therefore non-scientific, because you are too, we are too, I am also too, because I'm a Marxist to some extent. So you don't bridge indigenous points of views and science if you don't, in my view, rehabilitate something which is called, and Marx was, a philosopher. And in philosophy, you have metaphysics, and it's not bad. And it doesn't mean to say that if you do philosophy as metaphysics, right? Because this is much more plural than secularism and much more global to some extent. And secularism is just a metaphysics among the others. And if you bridge that with historical materialism, then yes, you have a different kind of knowledge. And never ever has the belief in pure economism been able to sort of resolve the properly philosophical problems within Marxism, which also what makes Marxism interesting and productive. So I guess I will stop here because it was already a bit long. I'm sorry to go out of the material, but I think we have to do both material and the others.
Thank you. Thank you. So as there is, were you satisfied? Yeah, they were because I rushed it, but then we do have the last. We said we gave an extra time, so there's this pressure when you're facilitating between like respecting time with people and So I'm trying to navigate it. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, just to answer the China and the main contradiction one with some time. Main contradiction. I believe the main contradiction is what Marx started to talk to us about in Capital Volume 3 around the metabolic rift. So it is our main challenge. It is the social regulation with nature and how we handle that. And there's a little bit of insight there. Engels tried to work a little bit more into that too, but it's basically the work of eco-Marxism nowadays, trying to figure out how we do it. And in a way, the regrowth, degrowth question handles that from different sides, but it's also trying to approach this contradiction. But we need to understand that the metabolic rift is a contradiction that is absolutely embedded in imperialism. So that's why we talk about the metabolic rift together with the conversation around ecological imperialism, how there's this unequal ecological exchange, and how nowadays we have this new dynamic of green colonialism, making things worse by the appropriation of places, cultures, territory in the name of the transition. And in that sense, I think it's quite important to bring in China, because China is that one thing that everybody tries to understand, but everyone's just scratching the surface, because we're talking about like a gigantic power, but lots of people involved directly. And this tendency of growth and also taking up resources that's connected to their own project, is connected to lifting people out of poverty and everything. But the relationship that China has to other states creates a lot of conflict of interpretation. So some people understand China as some new kind of imperialism. Some others talk about economic expansion and South-South cooperation. I think there's a room to discuss all of this, but in terms of climate change specifically, we know that China has been a major player in developing technology outside of the private stronghold of the patents. So there's something positive around that. There's a lot of learning to be done in terms of implementing infrastructure fast, the way that China offers as well. But at the same time, the perspective is very much focused, and here comes a disagreement again, on this eco-modernist perspective of like big, large projects, and that will require loss of resources. And I think that that reaches a ceiling at a certain point, and it can't just go around being exported. So one of the challenges that we face in Latin America is that the presence, a lot of the Chinese companies, here we can help you with your transition, is that, well, can we just import the model that what's being done there? And that's going to come in a completely different territorial racial framework in the way that we do things in Latin America, which connects to the point on indigenous methodologies, in the sense that indigenous methodologies are also about organizing. And I think something that's been really powerful, especially in the past years, is showing that there's a perfect bridge between indigenous organizing and the more socialist camp around non-commodification. Like making a stand that you will not turn this into a commodity. Nature cannot become completely embedded within the market capitalist system. And this is very helpful too, in the sense that it forces us to bring other species into the conversation as well. So like a multi-species approach that will be useful for us to getting our heads out of the anthropocentric aspect of the Anthropocene.
Thanks a lot for this beautiful weaving through the questions and the interventions. Yeah, I think you were going to answer the last one. Were you?
There was something about political prisoners in Egypt and solidarity with them, or absence of solidarity with them.
Sabrina addressed
talked about it. Okay.
Well, I was going to invite for a last round, because we did give each other. I was inviting to just give one question that you want people to leave with. So it should be short. It's not an explanatory thing, but a question you want to leave people with, so we can all think about that.
We're supposed to say this? Or...
If you want to.
Well, what I was going to say earlier, and I think it is a really hard question, is that, and I think a lot of, we're in Canada, a lot of these Indigenous struggles against pipelines or against extractivist projects, they are in fact struggles against capital. And again, I think that what I'm trying to trace out is that that is also the struggle that we face for climate change, is a struggle against capital. So again, thinking through how these movements can stitch together organizations that have the power to actually, again, erode the power of capital, you might have a chance for particularly these indigenous struggles to actually win more often. Because unfortunately, there's been inspiring examples of victories of indigenous struggles, particularly in the kind of idle no more phase here in Canada, but there's lots of struggles that fail and lose because capital is so darn powerful. And so, you know, even I think one of the more inspiring struggles in the United States in Standing Rock, which to me was able to really take a kind of a water-based struggle, a land-based struggle, and really create a mass politics around it, where there was, you know, people converging from all over the world in solidarity with the water protectors, and it really, you know, created a kind of level of political power much stronger than I've seen in a lot of sometimes these local struggles. But even that struggle, you know, after Obama stopped the pipeline, then of course we got Trump, who came in and just plowed out the protesters, and now the Dakota Access Pipeline carries oil. And so we need to build enough power so that the Dakota Access Pipeline can't succeed, right? And we just don't have it yet. And so I think we, again, when we talk about solidarity with these indigenous struggles, we need to think about building solidarity that builds power. And the same, we're all facing the same enemy, it's capital, and that's the problem.
All right. Consider this problem as a question.
Yeah,
So
I don't know what the question is.
I think the question will be, because we talked about the COP a lot, sorry to bring that up, but I think we have hacked the conversation. We know how to, you know, generate buzz around climate change. There's been like different types of direct action, peaceful, non-peaceful around this, but they are hijacking the agenda. How do we hijack the agenda? And I think one of the questions for us has to do with calendar, again, time. We are still very much stuck on these climate negotiation calendars. We are talking about this right now, but generally society is not. When it comes into the end of the year, November, December is going to be on the headlines of newspapers because world leaders are meeting in Dubai, and then we're going to be talking about this again, and it's going to make people think that, okay, something is being done again. So our problem, perhaps like I'm posing as a question, is like, how do we hijack the agenda permanently, so we're not actually stuck on this particular calendar of action? Oh, now this day is going to be a climate march, or that date we're going to have a climate strike. The permanent action is something that we're really missing here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, because this is, you know, the last thing. Just two things. The first thing is about the solidarity with prisoners. I mean, Sabrina answered a little bit, but I realized I didn't. There is just two things that I wanted to say, because someone talked about Egypt, right? When the question was asked. And how can I say that? Of course, the question of indigenous communities is very central, but at least my impression is that if we're only focused around American-centric questions of how climate activists are able to sort of, you know, organize with indigenous communities, which is very important in America, but it's in America, right? I think that, and I'm talking about the point of view of European climate activists, that if you take a country like France, you know, most intellectuals who are ecologists and so on live in a country, I mean, who are, of course, you know, interested in the Amazonian, which is, of course, very important, and so on and so forth, but they're French, right? And as mostly white French people, they don't really take into account the fact that most of the migrant communities in their countries, which are also facing who are frontlines communities, if you like, you know, to use this word, are in fact come from the Middle East, North Africa, mostly, and West Africa. Black people, Arab people, most of the time racialized as quote unquote Muslim, right? So it means that the question of frontline communities is linked to that as well, right? And not just, and you can't solve that via just importing, models that come from, the question of systemic racism or settler colonialism in America, right? So this just to say that it's about also situated colonialities. Now the question, two questions. First question is, how do we also take this, not only part of the world into account, but also the kind of stakes that it raises, because the Middle East is such a central region also in the world. Just to some extent, you could even say that the creation of the region itself and the word for the regions is intrinsically linked to oil, So second thing, second question or first question is, how do we make sense of that, right? And it's not to, put one question above the other, right? Not at all, right? And the second thing, and this would be my last point, to quote Marx again, there is in this writing on the Commune, Marx says, no, it's not actually, it's in the critique of the Gotha program. And he says something fascinating. He says, he criticizes the program, and he says, socialists should never say that the state will or should educate the people. It is the people who have to educate the state. So my last question would be, how do the people, we the people, educate the state and the states? Thank you.
Merci. Thank you to all for your generosity and for your patience towards the sportsy style towards the end. I appreciate the enthusiasm. Je vais terminer en français. On va quand même demander de faire un petit mot de clôture. Je vais le faire rapidement, comme je l'ai exigé des autres, à savoir, on arrive toutes d'une multiplicité d'angles puis d'ancrages, de différentes luttes qui nous habitent profondément, là. Puis, on arrive avec différents traumas, différents enracinements, différentes histoires, et on tisse des luttes différentes. Donc, la question que je pose, en fait, c'est si on reconnaît que ces ancrages-là, ces histoires-là sont réelles, que les traditions politiques, les ambitions sont nécessaires, mais qu'elles sont aussi insuffisantes chacune. Et que là, dans le contexte de crise de marasme, de folie écologique, il y a un travail de convergence à tricoter, que là, les occasions se multiplient, mais là, en fait, ça génère beaucoup d'occasions de collaboration, mais aussi d'interférences. Parce que là, on est tous en même temps, puis il y a une espèce d'agitation. Fait que ma question, c'est quelles idées, quelles pratiques, quelles capacités on doit cultiver pour s'assurer de devenir beaucoup plus que la somme de nos parties, une à côté de l'autre. Voilà la question avec laquelle moi je vous laisse. Merci. Puis évidemment, en remerciant, on peut continuer à applaudir. Merci à l'équipe de la Grande Transition, aux équipes de traduction, à tout le staff, toute l'écoute. Yeah!
Ouais. Merci.
Merci à vous, c'était cool.
Yeah,
it's okay. We're just fine. You see emergency, how it goes.
So, but you worked in the end.
No.
It's a lot of stuff to cover.
Yes.
Causing pains.
Be in touch.
Yes.
Really nice meeting you.
It was nice meeting you. Let's talk about these like decentralized private energy project stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think
Yeah.
like our research converges a lot in that point. Yeah.
Okay.
But that was the slowest I've ever spoken. Right. We should, but for that, we also need to reduce the work week, so we have more